Chapter 8. I often thought that how I woke up would affect the rest of my day. Like anything else, days had first impressions, and first impressions stick, whether it was because I woke up from an alarm, or possibly because of some other horrible occurrence. Some days just weren't worth getting out of bed. So when I woke up to Bruno sitting next to the couch, blasting me with hot, nasty dog breath as he sniffed at me, I knew that this day probably wasn't worth my time. Ignoring him, I closed my eyes, hoping he would take a hint. He snorted and nudged my pillow, then waited for a response. "Go away," I groaned, losing my patience. Bruno whined while pacing next to the couch before belting out a bark of frustration. "Get, you lousy mutt, before I make a sandwich out of you," I shouted, grabbing the blankets that had been put over me at some point during the night and turning my back to Bruno. He growled disapprovingly, grabbed the corner of my pillow, and pulled it out from under my head. I turned to give him a good smack before he bolted upstairs with my pillow between his teeth. "Fine, keep it," I yelled, and pulled the blankets over my head. "Just for that, I'll see to it you spend the night outside from now on." I started to feel myself drift back into a deep sleep before I smelled something that I hadn't smelled in a while. Coffee. It was enough to make me change my mind about going back to sleep, instead choosing to venture out to greet the day. I dragged myself off the couch and up the stairs. Each step was met with a crack or pop of my joints as I climbed toward my reward. Still half asleep, I steadied myself with my hands on both walls. At the top of the stairs, Bruno sat, looking very proud of himself, with my pillow still in his mouth. As soon as I got within reach of him, he darted off yet again to the kitchen. As I got within earshot of Lily and Saul, laughter broke the silence of the morning. Pausing at the sound briefly before rounding the corner, it struck me as almost foreign. I struggled to remember the last time I had heard anyone laugh. "Well, needless to say, the boat sank, and I never figured out what caused that rash," Saul said as I walked into the kitchen. "And to answer your question, no, I haven't been back to Mexico. One night in jail is more than enough for me." I was stunned. The scene almost looked normal to me. Lily glided through the kitchen with ease, her golden curls swinging about as she shifted back and forth, tending the stove, while chopping up vegetables on the space next to the burners. "Still could use a cheeseburger," I said to myself quietly, noticing her thin, pale legs. She was close to my aunt's size, but because she was so skinny, the dress hung a little looser than it probably should. Nevertheless, it was still an improvement to what she had on yesterday. Bruno had abandoned my pillow in the middle of the floor and went to work eating anything and everything that made its way to his level. "Good morning," I half moaned as I picked up my pillow, brushed it off, and tossed it onto a couch. Saul sipped at his coffee, patiently waiting for his opportunity to sample Lily's cooking. The kitchen had been transformed from its original rotten state. Counters that had been covered in years of dirt and grime were now so clean you could eat off of them. Dusty glass pendant lights were now crisp little gems that hung over the island in the middle of the space where Saul sat. After filling a mug for myself, I took a seat next to Saul with the windows at my back at one of the place settings Lily had set out. After cracking my knuckles and wrapping them around the steaming cup, I felt life flood my veins as I took the first sips. Looking over the neatly folded napkin on the white porcelain plate, I started to wonder how long Lily had been up. "So, Saul," Lily said, "you live here by yourself?" Saul shrugged in acknowledgement. "Yes, but that wasn't my intention when I built this place." "What changed?" she asked. "My wife, the big entertainer, always had something planned. The little family she had left was always coming and going. I often hosted business guests, so when I designed this place, I wanted them to have their own space as well." He was brushing aside the question. "You sure that's what was going through your mind when you were building it?" I prodded. "Ah, that's good. Tastes like victory," he replied after taking another sip from his steaming mug. "Okay, fine. Lily, you ever been married?" Lily's stunned expression at the question was all the answer Saul needed. I see. Well, when you're head over heels in love, all you can see is the person in front of you. Sometimes not even that. You tend to only see their good qualities and overlook things you shouldn't when you're dating. He paused, taking a breath and draining his coffee cup as if fueling up. Understand, I loved my wife. She was the foundation, the very driving force behind everything I did. Wise, beautiful, patient, intelligent, calm in the face of adversity. You can't understand how it feels to have someone like that as your complement in life to help you, guide you, support you in good times and bad. He sighed at the thought. This world suffered a great loss when she was taken from me. Much, much too early. That being said, her mother and aunt were polar opposites of her. Gigi, my great nemesis. He almost snarled as he said her name. What no one tells you is when you marry someone, you really marry the family. And of course, Danielle adored her mom and her aunt, who was a constant counterpart. Virginia. When my wife was around, they acted civilized. But as soon as Danielle left the room, that's when they really showed their horns. Those two never went anywhere alone. They never actually came right out and ridiculed you, but I could always see it in their eyes. But alas, when I was designing this place, my lovely wife wanted me to create a place for her dear mother and aunt. He shook his head as he recalled the dilemma. So there I was, designing what would become my kingdom and forced to carve out a little piece of it for my sworn enemies. Finally, I had a moment of inspiration, he said smugly. Under the ruse of wanting them to have their own space, I added a guest house. That way they wouldn't need to be under the same roof technically. I placed it as far away as I dared, then connected them via the wall surrounding the courtyard. I just told everyone that I used castles we visited as my inspiration. And just for good measure, I designed a small apartment completely separate, just so I would have a place to escape. He grinned briefly before continuing. But, as you know, shortly after the house was complete, I lost her. The guest house has never been used or even furnished. Neither was a good portion of the house. I simply have no need for the space. Where are your in-laws from? Lily asked, seemingly concerned. Florida. That's where they keep old people, he said sharply. Oh, she said. I hope they're safe. Yes, let's hope, he croaked reluctantly. Watching Lily move around the kitchen, grabbing pots and pans out of some drawers and pulling spices out of others, made it seem like she had cooked here all her life. I found myself in a daze and helpless while I waited for the promised meal. Bruno sat on her other side at attention, faithfully keeping watch to make sure any dropped food didn't get cold once it hit the ground. Where did you get the eggs? I finally asked Saul. From my chickens, he replied. Where else? I like fresh eggs. And do you have any idea how far it is to the nearest grocery store? I try to make as few trips into town as possible, which reminds me, when we're done here, both of you have work to do. We should be fine for a while, but honestly, it vexes me as to where you two think we're going to get enough food to make it through the winter. Honestly, we're really not as isolated as you think. And this isn't exactly a farm. Even I have to go to the grocery store once in a while. Up here, it's a good idea to keep some extra supplies around in case of a blizzard. So we're not immediately in trouble, but that could change. The last thing you want is to starve in your cabin because you weren't prepared. You're lucky I just made a trip into town and stocked up. Once I was trapped up here during a blizzard that lasted 2 weeks. By the time I was able to get back to town, I was down to the last shelf of canned carrots. I swore to myself that would never happen again. So, I have a lot of canned food as well as certain staples, but we are going to have to replenish our stock every chance we get. Winter is right around the corner, so that means we're going to have to hunt as often as we can. As soon as spring hits, the river has always been good for fish and we can grow some food. But in the meantime, we're going to have to be smart about how we use what we have." Lily pulled out 3 plates, divided up the eggs, hash browns, and toast, and slid 2 plates over the counter to Saul and me. "Wow, this is great, Lily. Thank you," Saul said. "You can stay." He took a big bite and kicked me under the counter. "Yeah, thanks," I said as I stared, awestruck, at the plate. I poked the simple breakfast in front of me with my fork to make sure this wasn't a dream. "You're welcome." She looked pleased as she untied her apron and hung it on a hook inside a closet. "Well, it's no secret I haven't been using the main part of the house for quite a while, but now it's nothing more to me than a maintenance headache." Saul trailed off before continuing. "I have an arrangement with that old farmer Harlan down the road. Do you remember him?" he asked as he looked at me. I shook my head uncertainly. "Anyway, he has a lot of cattle, and I just so happened to buy a cow from him, so the freezer is mostly full of steaks and ground beef. When we're done here, I'll see what I can do to get us some more. Maybe pay him a quick visit." Saul paused only to scoop up a mouthful of breakfast. "Unfortunately, this place requires a lot of work to keep running. Typically, there would be a staff of at least 2 full-time employees tending the gardens, cleaning, making sure nothing grows around the panels that power this place, cleaning them. You wouldn't believe how quickly they get dirty. Seriously reduces their effectiveness." "What happened to your staff?" I asked, thinking back to the early days of the outbreak when people started to go missing from illness. Did they just not show up one day or something? "Yeah, something like that." He winced. "I fired them." "What? Why?" I asked. "Not one of my better moments," he admitted. "But luckily I have you two to replace them. How fortunate for me." I cringed at the work detail Saul would dream up as I recalled my time spent here last time. "Is that the only source of power for this place?" Lily asked curiously. "Yes. You wouldn't believe what the power company wanted to charge me to run lines all the way up here. It's immoral. I could build my own power plant for what they wanted, so I did. Most of the places around here are hunting cabins and are self-sufficient. There are no services here. No natural gas, power, or sewer. The roads don't even get plowed in the winter unless I do it myself," Saul replied, cleaning his plate. "And one more thing. As I said before, there is traffic around here. People looking for good hunting spots and the like. I'm sure there will be more of them. I think it's the season anyway. Might not be a bad idea to hide the driveway. It's bad enough people could accidentally stumble onto the property, but I think it might be a good idea to do what we can not to encourage it. Sometimes, due to the lackluster way the entrance looks, hunting groups see it and think it's an access road to the state land. I always get people pulling all the way up then realizing it's a residence. If things are as bad as you say it is, then I'm afraid some of them might want to stay." "Aren't you being a little paranoid?" I asked while clearing off the counter. "It's way overgrown. I was looking for it and almost missed it. The only hint of anything back here are 2 tire tracks in the weeds." "Well then, it should be easy for you to hide," Saul snapped. "And I thought I was paranoid," I said. "You think you might be overreacting?" "Paranoid?" Saul said incredulously. "Apparently not," he snapped. "I didn't think I'd have to worry about anyone wandering up my driveway either, but here we are. The population just tripled. Quadrupled if you count the dog." I relented, knowing how conversations like this usually ended with Saul. Lily's eyes darted back and forth from Saul to me. Clearly not interested in getting involved, she changed the subject. "So the hunting is good around here?" "The best," Saul answered confidently. "Do you hunt?" Lily asked. "Well, no," Saul said. "As a matter of fact, that sounds like something Vince here can do to earn his keep." He sat up straight in his chair, pleased with his new idea. "You think you can handle that?" "Sure," I said confidently. "How hard can it be? Most people I know just use hunting as an excuse to get hammered in a tree and wait for something to shoot at. If a bunch of drunk guys can manage to bag a deer once in a while, I'm sure I can figure it out." Lily snickered. "Yep, we're going to starve. I won't get my hopes up of you adding anything to the pot." "Well, it's not going to happen with that attitude." I took a little offense to her lack of confidence in me. I gathered my plate off the counter and delivered it to the sink, eager to get started with the day's tasks. "Thanks again for breakfast." "Any time," she said, as I left. I went back downstairs to my backpack and pulled out a fresh shirt. The one I was wearing was starting to feel and smell as though I had been wearing it far too long. I folded up the blanket and set it to one side of the couch. "Thanks for the blanket. I was so tired last night I don't remember anything past my head hitting the pillow," I said to Saul as he came down the stairs on the way to his apartment. "Don't thank me. Must have been Lily. I would have let you freeze." Saul pulled on his coat and gloves, then tied his boots. "One more thing," he added before exiting the basement to the courtyard. "I have no intentions of feeding that dog with our food, so you'll have to figure out what you want to do with him. If it were up to me, I would put him down and be done with him. No reason you should drag it out." I started to protest, but Saul had already shut the door behind him. It wasn't something I had thought about. Could Saul really be that cruel? Or was he just trying to think ahead? He did have a point, but I didn't think I could do that to Bruno, or allow him to do it for me. Just then, Bruno came barreling down the stairs after me as I walked through the gym and into the long hallway that led underground to the garage. As he trotted next to me, I tried to think how I could feed him without getting into our food. I noticed his sunken ribs and realized he had eaten the rest of his food the previous night and hadn't had anything else since. "One thing at a time," I said to myself, trying to push that thought as far from my head as possible. The storm shelter underground was halfway between the main part of the house and the garage, and also doubled as a guest area. It had everything needed to live comfortably for some time in the event of a storm, or some other catastrophe. I hardly noticed a difference in the decor as I entered the tunnel to Saul's apartment. The transition was seamless, making it hard to pinpoint the end of the main house's foundation. If I didn't know any better, I'd think I was in just another section of the basement and not walking to another building. On the left and right were various storage rooms with heavy steel doors shut with latches, essentially making them vaults. In the main area, things were more suited for living, furnished as one would expect from this house. There was the same welcoming warmth from the in-floor heat as the rest of the house, despite it being polished concrete. The white walls boasted an art collection rivaling many museums. They made the walk through the tunnel seem like a stroll through a Manhattan gallery. Just before the end of the tunnel, a bluish light spilled into the hall through a glass door. As I passed, I noticed the massive battery bank lining the walls. It was hard to imagine the expense that went into building a house of this size and running it primarily on solar power. Even still, I remembered the day the panels showed up on a truck during construction. Saul was so excited it made me wonder if it was actually cheaper to power a house that way, or if Saul just liked the idea of building a house that was self-sustained. During the construction, I expressed my doubts to Saul about his array keeping up with the demands of the house. He eagerly laid out the projected power consumption against the array's average output, as if he was presenting his company's annual budget. He indicated the needs for lighting, heating and cooling, appliances, and the like. Saul had meticulously thought of every detail. I stared through the glass a while longer before continuing down the hall to the stairs to the garage. As soon as I stepped in the garage, motion sensors triggered the lights to gradually turn on. "Wow, that was dramatic," I told Bruno as he followed behind me, then curiously sniffed at the air. My shoes squeaked on black, polished floors as I weaved in and out of cars on display, and did my best not to scratch anything. The only speck of dirt I noticed was under a rusting old beater truck that showed years of use. There was a large closet at the back of the garage, stuffed with tools and other gardening supplies. Looking over the unorganized jumble of rakes and clippers, I tried to imagine how I'd hide the driveway and what I needed for such a task. With a large arsenal of tools to choose from, I ended up grabbing a small handsaw. Before heading out, I grabbed a remote for the gate out of Saul's beater truck and left through the service door. Bruno could hardly contain his excitement as he darted out the door the second I opened it to greet the morning. The ground crunched beneath my feet with the light layer of frost on the ground, courtesy of the light rain we got last night. "Wait for me!" Lily shouted as she darted out of the house. "Do you mind if I come with you?" she asked. She fumbled with the buttons on her coat because of her thick mittens. "I've always loved mornings like this. Saul told me I should walk down by the willows before the sun melts the frost." "No, I don't mind at all." I finally got sick of watching her fumble with her mittens and stopped to button her coat up for her. "You know, it's much easier without mittens on." "I'm perfectly capable of buttoning my own coat." She snapped it back and glared at me. "Watching you try to button your coat with those mittens on is like watching a monkey try to open a coconut," I said impatiently. "If I need your assistance, I'll be sure to let you know. Don't forget that little old me managed to make it all the way up here unbeknownst to you." Walking through the willows was almost like being in a cave. Covered in frost, the leafless branches looked like stalactites hanging from a frozen ceiling. "How amazing!" Lily looked around in every direction. I considered catching her hand as she swayed, but remembered the last time I lent her my assistance. "Whoa!" she yelped, grabbing onto my arm as she slipped on some ice. She was so loud even Bruno jumped. "I hate the cold. I think shivering should be considered exercise. While I agree getting out of the city was a good idea, I think we should have found a way to isolate ourselves on a tropical island somewhere, or we should have at least fled south. How long do you think we need to lay low?" "Who knows? Things can't continue like this forever. For better or worse, it won't last long," I said glumly. "What do you mean?" she asked. I thought for a second before I answered. "There are two possibilities. Either the virus will mutate into a strain that isn't dangerous, or it will run out of people to infect." "I can't help but wonder what's happening to all my friends back in town. Or if I should have stayed, or—" I cut her off. "You made the right decision. Where else would you be safer than here?" "You're right, but one can't help but wonder," she said. "Where do you think it came from, anyway? The flu, I mean. What makes this one different from others?" "Maybe someone just left the window open at the CDC," I said jokingly. Lily glared at me, clearly not amused. "It's actually kind of complicated. There's more than one type of flu. There's the one that goes around every year infecting a good number of people. Those are types B and C. The influenza virus is constantly changing and mutating, which is why they give flu shots every year. They try to guess what strain will be active that year and plan accordingly. The most dangerous kind is another type altogether. Type A is in animals like birds and pigs. Normally, it can't be spread to people, but it's always trying, regardless. That's one of the reasons pandemics are an eventuality. Even if a virus wipes out a town and runs out of people to infect, the virus never really dies because it's always carried in animals. It has nothing but time to change and adapt to its surroundings, becoming more effective and dangerous. Our bodies are always fighting off disease, and we're very good at it for the most part, but every once in a while, the viruses are compatible. Birds can infect pigs. In turn, pigs have very similar cells to people, so from that point it could jump to us fairly easily. That's why the swine flu was all over the news a few years back. But let's say a very contagious virus that is not deadly infects someone who is also infected with a virus that is very deadly. Think of something like rabies. It kills almost everyone who gets it, but it's not that dangerous because it's very hard to catch. The flu doesn't have a very high mortality rate, but spreads extremely easily. The viruses can end up infecting the same cell and mix genetic information. The new daughter virus formed from that process is often very lethal and very contagious. It's rare, but consider where it started. The area in China is a very densely populated area that's known for its close contact with animals. Butchering livestock exposes all the parts of the animal that contain the virus. Intestines, liver, or blood, so it's only a matter of time before it happens. And since it's new, no one has natural antibodies to fight it off. I think that's what happened here, but this one seems to have its own unique properties. There's no question that this is a new one. I always thought it was interesting that a virus could do so much damage. I mean, technically, it's not even alive. It fails to meet all the requirements of the definition. Specifically, it can't reproduce on its own. To do that, it needs a host. And in this case, it's us. I paused, then said, "But then again, I'm not a doctor. What do I know?" "What do you do for a living?" Lily asked. "Mason laborer. Just a grunt. All I do all day is combine a mixture of rock and water for a bunch of knuckle-dragging stone cutters." Lily gave me a sideways look. "But I read a lot," I added, thinking back to the stacks of books I lifted from the library before hunkering down in my apartment. We got to the main gate, and I pulled out the remote and pushed the button. It creaked and groaned as it labored to open, dragging a little on the ground from all the overgrowth, and came to a stop 3/4 open. I clicked the remote once more, but got no response. "Guess that's that," I said finally. "A lot of good that's going to do for us." "Hey, what's the plan?" Lily asked with excitement, as if we were about to cure cancer. "Saul's worried someone will think this is an access point to the land behind his property. I personally think he's being a little paranoid, but I don't have the energy to argue with him." "All right, first things first." Lily let go of my arm and rolled up her sleeves, only to roll them right back down because of the cold. "I'll stand over there and let you know when it becomes invisible." She headed over to the other side of the road and stood with her hands on her hips and had a look of purpose on her face. Shaking my head, I started to hack off limbs of other trees and fill in the entrance. "A little more on the left," Lily commanded. "No, my left. Can't you find any that are prettier? I feel like there are better choices than ugly evergreen branches. How about that one over there?" She pointed to a pile of branches that looked the same as the branches I was already using. "Now it looks invisible," she said, nodding her head in approval. "We make such a good team. Aren't you glad I came to help you?" "Of course I am," I said. "I really hope Saul has a lot of edible critters running around on all this land. After doing a quick inventory, I really think we may starve," Lily pointed out. "Well, we're not going to survive with that attitude," I replied. "I don't know how Saul was expecting to survive on what he has stored down there," she said unenthusiastically. "He just had a bunch of canned goods, a pile of steaks, beer, and a bunch of frozen pot pies." "Those things are awesome," I blurted. "I'm surprised he's in as good shape as he is with a diet like that. Does he know how bad red meat is for him? Not to mention processed food? Did you know we don't need as much embalming fluid when people die because of all the preservatives we eat?" "That's how most guys eat," I said simply. "Also, he was only planning on feeding himself. I'm sure we'll figure something out." "Well then, that solves the mystery of why women live longer than men," she replied with a grin. "Are all men so short-sighted?" "No, we just take our time maturing. Most guys don't become responsible until they turn 40 or so." I thought about all the guys I knew that age. Actually, probably more like 50. But by then, all of our bad decisions have caught up with us. We already have clogged arteries and the like. That is, unless we have someone around to inspire or nag us to eat better. I looked around for the saw and wondered briefly if I had misplaced it under the pile of brush before finding it. But I try not to worry too much about it. After all, it's part of the adventure. "There's yet another common trait." She shook her head contemptuously. "And that's not even the worst part of it. Even with all that junk food, I couldn't find any chocolate. I know it's such a trivial thing to want, especially given the circumstances, but you don't understand. I always have chocolate in the house." "You sound like a junkie." "It's true," she confessed glumly. "I've been chocolate-free for 2 months. 2 months too long. What I wouldn't give for just a nibble of some dark chocolate with a touch of sea salt." She sighed as she turned for the house. I laughed as I looked over our work. The entrance to the driveway looked just like any other part of the unkempt landscape. Satisfied, I turned and followed Lily. She had an uncertainty to the way she walked, avoiding any patches of ice. I laughed to myself as I thought about how she looked like a penguin waddling down the driveway in her oversized coat. Eventually, the woods around her swallowed up the sound of her footsteps, and I was left by myself in silence, able to hear my own thoughts once again. While I stood there enjoying the last bits of peace and quiet, I was interrupted by a noise, faint and distant, but unmistakably the sound of diesel engines. It could be anyone, I said to myself. It probably was just someone out for a drive in their work truck going to get supplies. But the possibility of it being more troops going about their business nagged at the back of my mind as I rushed to catch up to Lily. I was far away from any major city, but the fact that there was any sign of civilization around, no matter how insignificant, made me wonder if we were isolated enough. Maybe Saul wasn't being paranoid after all. Once I caught up to her, I grabbed Lily's arm to steady her as we walked the rest of the way. With her endless questions and comments, I was able to put the sound of the trucks out of my head and move on. Bruno ran ahead of us and exited the woods. "Do you think we're approaching this the right way?" Lily asked. "What do you mean?" "Well, I mean, hiding the entrance and making sure no one finds us." "What would you suggest?" I asked, puzzled. "Staying away from people is almost a guarantee that we won't get sick. Why on earth would we invite random people to come stay with us? It would defeat the purpose of coming up here." "I understand all that. It makes perfect sense, but I can't help but notice this is a very large house, with lots of room. Surviving is important, but I think we may be forgetting something." She paused just before the house. "You ever hear the saying, if you want to go fast, go alone? If you want to go far, go together?" "Yeah." "Well, there is something to be said for strength in numbers," she said. "You know, many hands make the work light and all that." "Yeah, but for every person we invite in, we also run a greater risk of infection. There, again, it defeats the purpose of coming up here," I pointed out. "Also, as you said earlier, we're going to have a hard time just feeding ourselves." "Well, we could set up quarantine for newcomers or something," she said. "Maybe isolate them for a week or so." "What happens if word gets out of a safe place, infection-free and with food?" I asked. I thought back to Aaron. That had been his plan. I wondered at times if he was still alive. "What happens if we exceed our limits? We'd have to eventually start turning people away. Who decides that? That is, assuming no one dies in isolation, or worse, gets us sick." Lily sighed. "I know all that. I guess I just have survivor's guilt or something. I can't stomach the thought of the hardships facing those left behind." She paused suddenly, then crouched to examine a track left in the melting frost. "Did you know white-tailed deer have excellent eyesight, smell 100 times better than a human, and run 35 miles an hour? It will most likely see you before you see it." She removed her mittens and traced the deer track with her fingers. "And you've never hunted before. Dear me, I do think we're going to starve." She snickered. "You see what I did there?" "Yes," I chuckled. "You're very clever." "Tell me, what is your plan?" she asked. "Well, I guess find a tree and wait in it until something edible walks under me." "I thought so." She walked through the service door to the garage. I followed her as she rifled through the closet where I had found the saw. "Hold these." She tossed some truck straps toward me as she continued to sift through Saul's tools. Eventually, she moved her search to Saul's beater. "Bingo!" she shouted as she dragged a cargo net out of the truck bed. Her arms were full of her findings as she found the melting trail left by the deer. I took the items from her and followed her with confusion. The trail led us deep into forest. Gradually, the warming sun melted the ground, turning it to sludge beneath our feet, but we trudged on. Lily wordlessly unbuttoned her long coat as she pushed her way through thick brush. Eventually, she stopped next to a bend in a small creek as it turned from the woods into a small clearing. She turned in a slow circle as she scrutinized her surroundings, then snatched the truck straps and netting out of my hands. After removing her hat and pulling her curls back, she sat on a log at the base of a grouping of trees and began to weave one of the straps through the perimeter of the netting. When she was done, she stood, then tossed the other ends of the straps over the sturdy limbs of the trees she was just sitting under. After securing the ratchet ends around the base of each tree in the group, she tightened them little by little until the netting made a small nest high above the tall grass and foliage. "Genius," I said, impressed. "I know. It's both a gift and a curse," she said vainly. "I usually prefer to remain a closet genius, only showing off on special occasions. Otherwise, people would always come to me to solve their problems, even ones they could solve themselves. You know, like Superman. But then, I thought about you trying to get comfortable in a tree and not seeing any deer, and I felt bad for you. 5 minutes sitting in the crotch of a tree, trying to get comfortable, and your butt would be asleep. Surprised you didn't know that." "How am I supposed to get up there?" I asked, as I looked over her contraption and the smooth bark of the trees. "You sure this is a good spot?" "Use your imagination. I can't do all your thinking for you. Just don't fall asleep up there. Wouldn't want you falling out." "Clear line of sight by a water and food source," she said, and pointed to the creek and the hint of an orchard in the distance. "And let's not forget the tracks we followed to get here." "Only it's kinda a long way to drag it back to the house," I pointed out. "Tell you what," she sounded a little frustrated. "I'll let you pick. Would you rather kill it or cook it?" "Actually, on second thought, it's not that far," I said, at the faint memories of the last time I attempted the nearly impossible and sometimes dangerous task most commonly referred to as cooking. Lily swiveled back and forth in a circle and scrunched her nose in annoyance. "What direction is the house?" "Well, I could tell you, but then the next time you're lost, you may not be able to find your way back. Really, I'd be an enabler and possibly cripple your natural development," I said sarcastically. Lily snickered as we walked a more direct path back to the house. Eventually, we crossed a gravel walkway that snaked through the woods past a small building that was part aviary and part greenhouse. The stone structure had a hint of the same features as the main house, with the exception of the large glass wall on the south side. Through the glass, the space looked unkempt, with pots and various other gardening materials strewn about and neglected. The north side, however, was a windowless stone coop, with a fenced-in section peppered with chickens roaming about, paying no attention to Lily and me as we approached. Unlike any coop I'd seen before, this one was a sort of dome cage, with the only access point being within the building. The wrought iron dome was oddly sturdy because it was secured to concrete footings. Lily knelt next to the cage and inspected a print in the mud. "Is that one of Bruno's?" I asked as she prodded the dog-like print in the soft earth. The print looked fresh, as if he was just recently here, eyeing the birds kept within. Saul must have kicked him out of the house. I'm surprised he wandered out this far. "He didn't." Lily placed her small palm in the print. They hardly covered the fresh track. She frowned as she stood and looked over our surroundings. "So then what's it from?" I asked. "Wolves," she said nervously. We quietly turned and headed back to the house. It wasn't long before the main tower of the house came into view. As we got closer to the open overhead doors, I could hear Saul's raised voice. "Harlan, come in. Talk to me. Come back." I walked in the garage while Lily continued on to the main entrance. Saul was sitting in the front seat of his old beater truck. Why he kept it around was always a mystery to me. I remembered him preferring that truck over a newer model, even when I was up for the summer helping him build the house. Back then it was old. Now it was just ancient. I guess it was like an old college sweatshirt people couldn't get rid of. As I walked up to the truck, I noticed that Saul was gripping the receiver of the radio tightly. "Harlan, answer me," he repeated. But there was no response. He continued to look off for a long while before finally acknowledging my presence. "I think it may be a good idea for you to keep a lookout tonight," he finally said with a concerned look on his face. He hung up the receiver and got out of the truck, slamming the door behind him. Rust fell from the underside onto the polished floor. He stomped away. Clearly his thoughts were occupied with what he had heard on the radio. Every night. Until... He trailed off as he disappeared into the tunnel to the main part of the house. But, I started to protest. Really? Yes, until further notice, he shouted back, his legendary temper flaring. You will do as I say, without question, regardless of any grievances you may have. I bit my tongue as Saul left. Bruno brushed up against my leg, then sat down next to me. His hopeful eyes stared up at me as a drool bubble formed on his left jowl. I sighed, remembering I hadn't fed him yet today. Let's see if we can find you something to eat. We entered the house via the front door and found Lily pulling sheets off the rest of the furniture in the living room. Clouds of dust filled the air as she tried to make sense of the neglected space. Such a mess, she exclaimed. If I had a room like this, I would never leave. But it looks like Saul hasn't been here in years. He hasn't, I confirmed as I rifled through the fridge and cabinets. I pulled out a loaf of bread, pulled off the ends, and fed them to Bruno one at a time. Why ever not? She asked. You heard him. I grabbed the end of a sheet. He has his separate space downstairs. This space was never really his style anyway. Systematically, she yanked the drapes open, flooding the space with the late morning light that was still washing the side of the house. Lily glowed as she looked over the view of the garden through the windows. Ah, better already. The days are getting shorter and cooler. Winter is so bleak and cold. We can't afford to squander the little sunshine we do get, don't you think so? I nodded in agreement as I looked over the fireplace. Like the rest of the room, it too hadn't been used in years. The wrought iron wood stand was also covered in spiderwebs and dust. I made a mental note to clean the ash out of it soon. I took off my coat and hat and set them on the nearest couch. As I folded the sheets that were strewn about the room, Lily eyed me, specifically my hair. Suddenly self-conscious, I ran my fingers through it and thought back to the last time I cut it myself in my bathroom. Lily grabbed a chair from the dining room and placed it in the middle of the great room, then retrieved the dish towel and scissors out of a drawer in the kitchen. Sit, she demanded as she stood behind the chair. I'll never be able to take you seriously with hair like that. I reluctantly sat as she pushed my hair around with her fingers and tried to figure out how to fix it. Tell me the truth, she said as she grabbed clumps of hair and started trimming. Did you lose a bet? I tried to think of a response that would keep me from admitting I willingly gave myself this haircut. Feel free to keep a lock of my hair as a souvenir to remember me. Lily snorted. Don't make it weird. I don't think I'll be needing one to remember you by. I don't think I'll be able to forget how you looked with this haircut even if I wanted to. Her precise cuts made me think she had done this before. Question, she said. Let's hear it. If you were the only person left after all the dust settles from this mess, what is the first thing you would do as the official king of the world? Lily asked, making idle chit-chat while she worked. You mean besides hunting and gathering? I asked. Sure, she replied, straightening my head, making sure her cuts were even. I haven't really thought about it, I admitted. Steal a cop car and go everywhere with the lights on. Maybe move into the White House and hang out in the Oval Office. Or maybe go to a museum and touch everything. The possibilities are endless, really. I don't think I would stay in one place for very long, though, that's for sure. At least not at first. Probably just keep moving and making sure I wasn't alone. See the world. Really? That's it? Travel? Why? She asked. People tend to die young in my family. My dad died early. My mom died when I was 17, and judging from the way Saul eats, that old fart doesn't have much longer to live either, I said jokingly. I have no reason to think my fate will be any different. Every moment should be treasured, never wasted. There's so much to see in this world, and I want to see as much of it as I can before I'm worm food. What about you? Wow, that is such a guy's answer. She walked around me in a slow circle as she looked over her work. Satisfied, she started brushing off my shoulders and removed the dish towel. I would move someplace warm, with the person I care most about. Somewhere with a beach and lots of fruit trees. That way, whenever I wanted a treat or something sweet, I could just pluck it off nature's buffet. Really, what else worthwhile is there to do in this world? That's such a chick's answer, I retorted, as I stood up and brushed off the bits of hair the towel missed. The feeling of a good haircut felt like a luxury. Thanks for the haircut. But there's only one thing I really want to do right now, I said, stepping uncomfortably close to Lily. What's that? She asked suspiciously. Take a nap. When I finally woke up, it was already dark out. As I sat up on the couch, I looked around for my pillow, but it was missing. Bruno lay next to the couch, scrunched up on it as if it were his bed. When I swatted him on his hind end to get him off, he jumped and sprang across the room. I slapped off the dog hair and put it back on the couch. Despite the hours I had spent sleeping, I still felt a little tired. The last couple nights had only seen low-quality cat naps and not the true restful sleep I required. Remembering what Saul said about keeping a watch at night, I reluctantly got up, grabbed my pack and rifle, and started to head upstairs. I knew all too well how he would react if I treated his demands as a minor suggestion. The fact of the matter was, I did feel like a guest, and it was probably a good idea to do as he asked, no matter how crazy his ideas. The scent of bleach and other cleaning supplies got stronger as I got closer to the main level. The dusty space had been thoroughly cleaned. The fireplace was big enough to roast a pig, and Lily had managed to fit most of the wood that was next to it in all at once. The heat was almost unbearable by my standards as I approached it, where I found Lily sleeping, curled up and burrowed in the thick couch like a tick. Despite the heat, she still slept wrapped in a blanket, her face framed in curls. As I peeked over the couch, the glow from the fire revealed the contented look in her expression. I decided to leave her as she was. I made the long climb up the 3 stories to the garden, the highest point of the house. Bruno trotted beside me as we went up the stone stairs. Once at the top, light from the moon poured in through the glass ceiling, illuminating my way beyond the master suite. As I walked through the space, I moved past furniture and a large telescope near the spiral steps that led to the garden. Old lawn furniture lay strewn about, most likely blown around from bad weather. Pots with dead plants lined the edges. Not surprisingly, Saul hadn't bothered to keep it up. On some level, the state of this area was a disappointment. If there was one part of the house that was truly a reflection of his wife, it was the gardens. To see them neglected as they were was the strongest sign Saul had truly done everything he could to bury her memory. If she could see the mess that had become of her gardens, greenhouse, and kitchen, Saul would never hear the end of it. In the center of the roof stood a large fire pit, with a stack of wood under a tarp next to it, ready to be lit. Bruno did his standard inspection of the perimeter, sensing no threats and feeling like he had done his job. He let out a snort, then hopped up, placing his paws on the surrounding parapet wall. He lingered and stared out into the darkness, keeping an ever-watchful eye out for anything out of place. I started to clear out a small area in the mess where I could spend the night. I arranged the furniture around the fire pit, set down my gear, and grabbed the lighter out of my pack after deciding that getting a fire going was my first priority of the night. "Ah, you remembered," Saul said as he walked through the door to the roof. His mood was already noticeably different from earlier. The way he could snap, then pretend it had never happened a little while later, was always a shock to me. "For a while there, I thought I had to remind you." I ignored his comment as I tried to get the semi-damp wood to light. I glanced at Saul as he set down a glass and decanter and pulled out one of the chairs. I couldn't tell if the slight redness in his face was from the climb or if he had already started sampling the contents of the decanter. As he sat down, it screeched as it leaned to one side. "We really don't want visitors for obvious reasons. But if..." Saul trailed off as he adjusted himself on the chair. "But if someone does stop by, discourage them from getting out of their car. How do you expect me to do that? I asked. Well, dream something up, he said, adjusting himself to the new angle the chair had settled into. Use your head. You could just... As Saul was just getting comfortable, one of the rusty screws on the chair popped loose, making it slump even more to one side. Piece of junk! He yelled, getting off the chair and sending it sailing off into the darkness. Without even bothering to see where he threw it, he was already flipping over a different chair by the time the first one crunched as it hit the concrete below. Ah, that's better. He positioned himself in the new, firmer chair. Anyways, if someone pulls up, shoot out the window of the car, or maybe aim for the trunk. But don't hit the tires or the engine. We want them to be able to drive away. He settled in, kicking up his feet on the edge of the fire pit. You going to make a fire or what? Patience, I said. Right then, the stone parapet wall around us started to glow, and I felt the fire's warmth on my fingers. Don't you think the police are going to have an issue with me shooting out windows of cars? Nah, shouldn't be a problem, Saul said confidently. I know the police chief. I saved his life once. I never could tell if he was joking or not when he said that. I knew he had once been an EMT, but he said it so often it made me wonder if it was true. That reminds me, be careful when you leave the house. You're fine if you stay close, but there are plenty of critters running around in these woods that can eat you. People aren't the only thing you should be watching out for. And I'm not talking about the bears either. It's the wolves. Their population is getting ridiculous. You have any idea how many chickens I've lost to those things? No matter what I do, it seems like they can always get in, dig under the fence or whatever. If you run into one, you could probably scare it off, but a whole pack and you're in trouble. Best be safe and always carry your rifle with you, especially if you do manage to get a deer. They'll be able to smell it. Once, after I collected eggs from my chickens, a wolf followed me all the way back to the house. I'll admit that being followed by a 150-pound wolf is scary. I only saw the one, but I could somehow tell there were others. He didn't attack, just followed me, all the while maintaining the distance between us, almost like he was escorting me back. I've never heard of a wolf deliberately hunting people as a main source of prey, but if one is hungry enough, I suppose anything is possible. Regardless, though, I kept an eye on him, my pistol near me. The joints of his chair screeched as he sat back, swirling his drink thoughtfully. That reminds me, if you're going to be up most nights, you'll want to finish cleaning up one of the basement rooms. You will find it's the best part of the house to sleep in during the day, so that you're nice and rested at night. What about Lily? I asked as I poked at the fire. She can stay where she is. If there's a problem during the night, one of us can wake her up easily enough. She's so much like Danielle. Always positive, Saul said, taking a sip from the glass he brought up with him. What do you mean? I asked as I found a chair of my own. Well, she puts on a front as if she can handle anything. But the truth of the matter is she's lost. It's up to us to keep things as normal as possible for her. Try to keep her mind off things, keep her busy. There's only so much we can do. We sat in a trance watching the flames dance and cast shapes and shadows all around us as it slowly started to die. She smells nice, I finally said. They always do, Saul replied, as if it was something that every idiot should know. What's that? I asked, pointing to what looked like a small wire sculpture of a girl dangling her feet off the side of the roof. Her dress was accented in some sort of red metal, and a curious look was twisted onto the tiny figure as it watched over the garden below. Oh, that, Saul said. Your aunt went to an art benefit and found an artist who made sculptures using only wire. The figures ranged in size from as small as that one to as big as 2 feet tall. She loved them so much she bought the artist's entire supply. 20 sculptures, I believe. Then she hid them all over the house and grounds. I've only been able to find 11 so far. Part of me doesn't want to find the rest. Every time I stumble across one, a flood of memories comes back, and for a second, it feels like a little part of us survived. I stood up and walked over to the edge of the roof and reached out to touch it. It was surprisingly sturdy and securely mounted to the stone. It's so expressive. Yeah, unnervingly so. Where are the other 10 you found so far? All over the place. In trees, hidden next to the creek, hanging off the side of the exterior, in the maze. All of them are completely unique, and I'm not sure they're entirely human. That's an artist for you. Sometimes a little too creative. I sat back down in my chair, suddenly feeling anxious. What did you find out from your friend earlier today? What friend? Saul said, confused. Oh, you mean Harlan. Well, I wouldn't consider him a friend, just a neighbor, and I even use that word loosely. His farm is miles away, but still the closest house around. You know, he had a nice setup on his farm. He's famous around here for his cattle. No one ever buys beef from the grocery store. If you buy ground beef from the store, you're lucky to get meat that's less than a year old. They have to dye it pink to make it look fresh. But with Harlan's, it's pink all the way through, not tinted, and always fresh. He always has orders to fill, so the meat never sits around long enough for it to go old. And don't even get me started on the steaks. Saul exaggerated the thickness of the cuts with his fingers. I'm not kidding. You aren't going to get a better cut of meat anywhere else. I helped him butcher a cow once. It's a very tedious process once they're quartered. We spent days cutting meat from bone and separating the choice parts from the other meat destined to be part of the ground beef. It was then that I decided I would never eat store meat again. Harlan pulled out a chunk of beef, covered in fat and bits of bone, and told me that the difference from store-bought meat and his was that the store wouldn't be so careful about discarding the extra bone and fat. Saul cringed at the thought. You know he sells that stuff by the 5-gallon bucket. Any less than that, he would tell you not to waste his time. I'm just glad I filled my freezer before you came up here. I probably got a whole cow down there. Saul poured himself another drink out of the decanter, took a large swig, then twirled the rest in the glass. The ice cubes clinked as they hit the sides. He looked thoughtfully into the fire. You know that restaurant in New York? I can't think of the name offhand. Saul thumped his head with his free hand, trying to jar the memory loose. Luga Steakhouse. No, that's not it. Peta Luga Steakhouse in Brooklyn. You ever been to that place? No, I replied. What? Why not? Just haven't, I said, frustrated at the fact that Saul was talking in circles. Well, they have the best steaks anywhere. For sure the best in New York, maybe even the East Coast. But I would take a steak from Harlan any day over that place. Focus, I said, irritated. Saul slumped down in his chair and swallowed the remainder of his whiskey. I don't think Harlan is with us anymore, he finally said. What do you mean? The point I'm trying to make is that everyone knew that Harlan was well provisioned and had lots of cattle. The last I talked to him, a couple days ago, he said he was getting bombarded with people wanting to buy meat from him. It's important for cattle farmers like him to make sure their stock doesn't get too low. I think he had to start turning people away. But before long, he started to discover people trying to steal cattle in the middle of the night. I guess the grocery stores were picked clean a while ago. In times of scarcity, being among the few who have is both a blessing and a curse. How long do you think this will go on? I asked, instantly remembering that Lily had asked me this question earlier. I think it will burn itself out sooner rather than later. I heard a rumor that something like 30% of people are already dead or dying. That's a big chunk of the population, but still a far cry from being an extinction event. Saul went to take a sip out of his glass, but stopped when he remembered he had already had the last of it. He promptly refilled it. I always wondered what you ended up doing for a living since you left. Still a mason. Saul choked on his whiskey. What? Still? Do you own the company or something? He managed to croak out in between coughing. No, I said plainly. No ambition. I guess it's to be expected, he said before I had a chance to answer. It's really not your fault. It's a generational thing. By the time I was your age, I had already built up and sold my first company. The money I got from that put me through school. Originally, I wanted to be a doctor. Took a bunch of classes and everything, but then I changed my mind and decided to become an architect instead. Those were some wild years, he reminisced. I went to school during the day and worked as an EMT during the night. Wow, I saw some crazy stuff. But I was glad when it was over. Keeping people alive after a terrible car accident or a random gunfight is very stressful. I had a hard time managing the stress from the ones we lost before we got them to the hospital. It was then I knew being a surgeon wasn't for me, so instead I focused on other things. You know what the trick is to business? Exponential growth. Start a company, get it rolling, then put a competent person in charge of it while you start the next venture. Always reinvest your profits, whether in training personnel or furthering your accounts via stocks. The worst thing is to spend your income instead of reinvesting it. Before you know it, you can retire at an early age. He sat back smugly as he twirled his glass. I actually don't think your generation has the drive mine did, though. Yours is perfectly content playing video games and not getting the job. But it's not your fault. I blame the schools. We both stared into the fire for a while before he added, and the parents, rap music, movies lacking substance. I'm sure probably the internet, too. No guidance counselors at any school will recommend getting the job as a grunt. Not that it would matter much anyway. Today's graduating class is only interested in the quick buck. Everyone wants to be a day trader, making big money early, then retiring at 25. I got that a lot when I ran a company. New graduates always had a chip on their shoulders, like the world owed them something. I think it's from their parents telling them how special they are, their entire lives. Then when they get started in their careers, reality sets in. If I remember correctly, you worked all the time. You were a slave to your company, I pointed out, in an attempt to discourage the speech I knew was to follow. It was a speech I had heard many times before. I guess you may be right, but I would rather be a slave to my company than a slave to somebody else's. The last thing in the world I wanted was a job. He curled his nose in disgust at the sound of the word. Don't misunderstand me, though. Work I like, but a job is something that will suck your very life force out of you for a meager wage. Young people always feel like they have all the time in the world, but as you get older, you begin to realize that your days are numbered, and there are a precious few of them. Just when I thought I had things figured out, right when I was getting ready to retire, that's when I lost your aunt. Now I feel like my younger years were a waste, accumulating all this. Now I have no one to share it with. Despite your shortcomings, I am pleasantly surprised you managed to make it up here without being snatched up at a roadblock or something. I did my best to avoid people. Yeah, you failed miserably. Not only did you bump into Lily, but you managed to bring her up with you, Saul pointed out. You know I should have quarantined you both or something before letting you in. For all I know, you both could be sick. Oh well, too late now. Saul took another sip out of his glass. His gold wedding band glinted in the firelight. She followed me, I said defensively. Saul leaned back in his chair, satisfied and no doubt feeling the effects of his drink. For a second I thought he was going to nod off, but he just sat there with his eyes half closed with a content gaze. I rubbed at the growing lump on the back of my head and cringed. Why did you have to hit me so hard? Well, I'm sorry, Saul said. What was I supposed to do? There was a stranger in my house. I knocked. No answer. I retorted. Well, you should have given me more time to get to the door. It's a big house, and I don't move as fast as I used to. I'm old. We continued to watch the fire eat the logs to a lump of glowing coals. As it got smaller, the cold of the night returned to the roof. I quickly stacked more logs on the fire and noted that I would be spending a lot of time collecting wood through the winter. I couldn't bear the idea of spending the night on the roof without a fire. Bruno shot up from where he was curled up next to my feet and ran to the parapet wall. He stared out into the darkness just as he had that night on the boat when he heard the voices from the other boats in the distance. After a while, he finally let out a deep, low growl in the direction of town. Saul and I both stood up and tried to spot what spooked him. A faint and very distant popping sound made Bruno's ears perk up, and an orange glow reflected off the clouds. You know there is no escaping it, Saul said, looking in the direction of the noise. That is, as long as people are still around. Saul had a look of concern on his face as he observed the reflection of the fire on the clouds. It's going to be a long winter.